complicated for me. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to do this lecture. Everyone has been extremely kind to me since I arrived. The bad news for all of you is that Dr. Prabandari told me that I had 45 minutes to talk. So if you go to sleep, I'm sorry. What am I going to talk about? I thought I'd tell you a little bit about where I'm from. I'm going to give you some context. I'm going to talk about smoking rates in the UK. And then I'm going to talk about 3 UK smoking-based studies, just as examples of the kinds of work which I've been involved with. They're very different studies. They don't really link together at all. They're just examples. So first of all, where am I from? I'm from, for anybody who's interested in European politics, we are at the moment part of Europe. In a couple of months, we may not be part of Europe. This is the UK. Here is Scotland. And here is Glasgow on the west of Scotland. So that's where I come from. I thought I'd give you some pictures of Scotland. Scotland has hills. It has castles. It has snow in winter. It has Highland cattle on the hills. It has some sheep. Hill in the 1st of January this year, the very beginning of this year, it was a high hill, it was a cold hill. I'm wearing lots of clothes. This is another picture of a hill that I took 2 weeks ago. So I like walking, as some people here already know, and I like hills. I thought I'd finish Scotland with a very stereotypical picture of a Scotsman with his bagpipes wearing his kilt. You do see people like this in the tourist areas. Glasgow, where I come from, is a big city. There's about 1 million population, has a big river running through it. It's another image of Glasgow. It made its money, in fact, via the tobacco trade in the 1800s. And then in the 1900s, a lot of very heavy industry. So a lot of shipbuilding in Glasgow. It used to be a very rich city. Now there are service industries. So it has a lot of grand buildings. That's the town hall. That's the university. And I thought you might be interested. This is actually a typical street where people in Glasgow live. This one is a very steep street, and actually I chose this picture because I live round the corner in a house. But people would live, these are flats, people would generally live in about that amount of the building. So they would have 2 or 3 of these windows. So that's a typical place where someone in Glasgow might live. Where I work, you've heard I work at the University of Glasgow. I work within an institute called the Institute of Health and Wellbeing, which is quite interesting because it crosses 2 of the university's colleges, medicine and social science, which really sums up what we do. We do both. The actual department is the Social and Public Health Sciences Unit. This is a snapshot from our website, just to show you that the aims of the unit where I work are to improve health, reduce health inequalities through the study of social influences on health and well-being. Why am I here? Well, I'll tell you a little bit in a minute, but the funding for this visit came from the Global Challenges Research Fund, or GCRF, which is a massive fund, a UK fund. And as it says here, it's to support cutting-edge research that addresses the challenges faced by low and middle income countries. Obviously, tobacco is one of those challenges in certain countries. So that's the end of about me. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about smoking rates in the UK. I'm starting with this slide, which shows adult smoking rates in Great Britain over about 40 years, from 1974 to 2012. Oops. And you can see here the male rates in 1974 were about 50%, and they were 20% by 2012. And the female rates have also dropped down to about 20%. So a massive drop in smoking rates over a period of about 40 years. And they have, in fact, continued to drop since then. At the same time, not surprisingly, young people's smoking rates have also dropped. So this shows at the top 15-year-olds. This is in Scotland, but it's similar to the rest of the UK. 15-year-olds and 13-year-olds, boys and girls, from 1982 to 2015. So about over 30 years. But you can see in 1982 and really until the mid-90s, if we choose 15-year-olds, their smoking rates they maybe dropped slightly, 30 to 25%, but they were pretty high. But since then, since 2000, whoop, they've dropped down and they've carried on. They're about here now, about 5%. If you're a teenager in the UK, you don't really smoke. So that is pretty interesting. Now, how have these changes happened? Definitely not by magic. This isn't a brilliant slide. It comes from Cancer Research UK, and they say smoking rates don't come down on their own. This squashes up the timeline, but it goes from 1950 to 2000. And it talks, there's the male rates and the female rates. Men were 60%, about the same as Indonesia in 1950. And this talks about some of the things that have happened in the UK over that time. So in 1954 was the very first study which showed a link between smoking and lung cancer. That was actually a study of British doctors. So that was published in 54. 10 years later, in 1965, advertising of tobacco on television was banned in the UK. So there's been no television advertising of tobacco for, getting on for 50 years. In the 1980s, there were the beginning of massive tax rises for tobacco products. If you're interested, in the UK, if you were to buy a packet of 20 cigarettes, 80% of the price that you pay is tax. Okay? That makes them very expensive, and obviously that makes it harder for people to buy. A lot of things have happened since 2000. A lot of mass media campaigns, stop smoking services, big health warnings. I'll show you some of these on the packets. In 2003, all advertising was stopped. So there's no billboard advertising, there's no sport advertising, anything like that. Nothing in the newspapers. You don't see adverts for tobacco at all. In the mid-2000s, the UK introduced smoke-free public place policies. So you are not allowed to smoke. You can smoke in the street, but you can't smoke anywhere else where the public go. You can't smoke at work. You can't smoke anywhere in restaurants, hotels, anything like that. So you don't really see smoking now except in the street. A bit later on, the UK introduced point-of-sale display bans. And that means that, when you go into a shop, you see lots of packets of tobacco. We don't see those anymore in the UK. They've been covered up. So this is a shop in the UK. They've got some batteries for sale here, some sweets. This is tobacco. It also says no ID. You have to show your age to buy tobacco. You have to be over 18. So what that means is that if you go in as a young person, you're not tempted, but you also have to know exactly what it is you're asking for. You can't just point. You have to know, and the man in the shop will open the shutter and take it out. It's a bit like an illegal drug. We've banned smoking in cars carrying children. If a policeman sees you, kids in the back of the car, and you're smoking, he's going to stop you. More recently, a European tobacco directive changed the number of cigarettes that people were allowed to sell. The smallest number of cigarettes that you can sell in the UK now is a packet of 20. You can't buy one, you can't buy 10, you can't buy 17, which is what the manufacturers used to do. You have to buy 20. Again, that makes it harder because it's more expensive. And most recently, in 2017, all tobacco packs now are standardized. And this, I don't know if you've seen, Australia has done this as well, and some other countries. This is a UK tobacco packet. So all the tobacco packets have big health warnings. This is a very nasty picture of somebody's foot. Smoking clogs your arteries. It's got get help to stop smoking. It's got a website. It says the duty's been paid. Here, smoking kills. The only thing, so every single tobacco packet in the UK looks like this. It might have a different nasty picture. They're all this brown colour. They all look exactly like this. The only thing that the companies are allowed to do, this says brand variant. This is where they'd be allowed to put Marlboro Lights or something. That's all they can do. So that the tobacco packets look unattractive. They can't advertise themselves because they all look the same. So that's what's been happening in the UK over the last few years. That's why tobacco has gone down so much in the UK. And actually, interestingly, it's against this background that Scotland, along with a few countries, have entered what is called the tobacco endgame strategy. I don't know if you've come across this idea, but the end game is the idea that policymakers will change how they work to say, we're not interested in controlling tobacco anymore. Controlling tobacco means tobacco still exists. We're interested in a tobacco-free future. What Scotland said in 2013 was, in setting out our aspirations, our wish for a tobacco-free Scotland, we've decided for the first time to set a target date by which we expect to realise this ambition. This date is 2034. So that was 21 years from then. It's only 15 years from now. And they said, in setting this target, we have defined tobacco-free as a smoking prevalence among the adult population of 5% or less. So they weren't saying naught, but they're saying pretty low. So smoking is a very peculiar thing to do. That's what Scotland is aiming for. Unfortunately, in Scotland, like many other countries, there are big differences in smoking rates according to how rich or how poor you are. This shows Scottish adult smoking rates according to level of deprivation from 1999 to 2012. So again, they're dropping for everybody. But this line shows the richest 20% of the population. By 2012, only 10% of them were smoking anyway. They're probably going to get down to 5% by 2034. But for the poorest 20% of the population, still dropping, but they're still at 35% in 2012. It's going to be jolly hard for them to reach 5%. So Scotland's got a lot to do. So that was my background about smoking rates in the UK. Now I'm going to tell you about 3 studies. As I say, they're just examples of the kind of work which I've been involved with. They are a Stop Smoking in Schools trial, or ASSIST for short, and that's what links to my visit here. The Tobacco in Prison study, or TIPS for short, and some analyses about movie smoking. So first of all, a Stop Smoking in Schools trial. And this was a school-based, peer-led smoking prevention program that happened about 15 or 20 years ago, originally, in the south of the UK. So it wasn't done by people in Glasgow, it wasn't done by me, but it was led by the person who now directs the unit where I work, and that's why we're interested in it. So, why do a school-based smoking intervention? Well, obviously, because it's really important to target teenagers before they start smoking. We know that most adult smokers took up smoking as teenagers. We know that nicotine addiction happens quickly in adolescence. We know that people who start smoking earlier tend to go on and be heavier smokers. And school-based interventions have several advantages. Certainly in the UK, they can be very good settings for smoking prevention because most teenagers go to school, so it's an easy way to capture most of them. And most of them stay at the same school for several years. So if you do some kind of intervention, some kind of study, you can follow them up and see what's happened. Assist is a peer-led intervention. And just a definition, a peer is someone from the same group as you, and they could be in terms of age or grade or status. They might be a friend, but they might not be a friend. So, for young people, a peer would be somebody who's in the same year group as you, somebody you hang around with out of school, that kind of person. And there have been a lot of adolescent peer-led interventions. Most of these are peer education. And what that means is that they're mostly same age or slightly older peers who deliver classroom-based lessons. So they have a bit of a teacher role. And that might mean that they actually lose the trust of some of their peers. And there is evidence that although these are quite good for changing knowledge and for changing attitudes, they're not so great for changing behaviours. And obviously behaviour, the actual smoking, is what you want to change. So Assist took a different approach. The young people who took part in that were peer supporters, not educators. And what they did is they were trained to just spread the word about not smoking, not in the classroom, just in informal conversations with their friends. So just to tell you a little bit about the intervention methods, what actually happened. Assist worked with 12 and 13-year-olds, just about the age when in the UK young people might start to smoke. The peer supporters, really importantly, were not chosen by the teachers. They weren't the volunteers who put their hands up and said, "Oh, me, miss, please can I be one of them?" They were nominated by others in their school year group as the kind of students that they respected or looked up to or thought were good leaders. So as I say, they're not what I would call the usual suspects who in the UK would be high achieving females. Some of these popular students, these peer supporters, were quite naughty students. They were kind of rebellious leaders. Some of them smoked, but they'd been chosen by their classmates as popular. And these popular students were taken out of school, right away from school, for 2 days of training. Teachers did not do the training. It was some other trainers, some external trainers who trained them. And they were taught about the dangers of smoking, how's a good way to talk with their friends. They did some role play, that kind of thing. They spent 2 days doing that. And then they were sent back into school and they were just asked to talk about smoking and to spread anti-smoking messages informally. So maybe at break times, maybe after school. And they did this for 10 weeks. That's what the intervention was. It lasted 10 weeks. The trainers went back a few times to see how they were getting on. And that was the official end of the intervention. The research part of Assist, it was a randomized control trial. So it was quite big. There were 59 schools involved. Half of them were intervention schools. So these schools did their normal smoking education, whatever it happened to be, plus Assist. And the other half were control schools. They just did whatever they normally did about smoking, usually a bit of education in lessons. Because there were so many schools, there were almost 11,000 students eligible to participate. There was a lot of evaluation. Obviously, the main outcome that people were interested in was, did it have an effect on smoking levels? But there was also an economic evaluation to see whether it was worth the money to do. And there was the process evaluation too, mainly qualitative methods, doing observations, taking field notes, looking at diaries, records, interviews with students, teachers and staff to really try and find out what was going on. How did the training work? Did the trainers do what they were supposed to do? Did the young people, the peer supporters, do what they were supposed to do? What did the teachers think about all this? Really, what was going on? So that's the methods. Just very quickly, some results. I'm going to show you, there's a lot of smoking results. I'm going to show you weekly smoking. So in the UK, any young person that smokes once a week counts as a weekly smoker, and that's counted as regular smoking. This is 2 years after the intervention. Remember, it was just a 10-week intervention officially. So this is 2 years later. And there's results for two groups of students. These are what the researchers called high-risk students. These were students who, even before Assist began, they'd tried smoking, they'd experimented with it, they were quite interested in smoking. And then I'm going to show you results for all the students in the year group, for the intervention and the control schools. So first of all, for the high-risk students, so 2 years after the intervention, 31% smoked in the intervention schools, but more, 35% in the control schools. And there was a significant level of P.07. For all students in the year group, 19% smoked in the intervention schools and 22% in the control schools, significant at P.09. Now, you might think, well, what's she talking about? That's not a very big difference. 4%, 3%. Why bother with that? Bother because there are very few interventions that have any impact on teenage smoking uptake at all. So even a fairly small difference is worth doing, it's worth trying to achieve. Because actually, if you take the whole population, a drop by 3% in the whole population represents a lot of people. The economic evaluation, which looked at the costs of delivering the programme and the savings, compared with the savings of fewer smoking-related health problems, concluded that Assist was cost-effective. And as I say, there was lots of work to understand the mechanisms behind what happened, what worked, what did not work. I haven't got time to tell you about that. You can ask me about some of it if you want. So the conclusions by the researchers from the study were that it definitely was effective in reducing adolescent smoking, and the findings could be generalised to secondary schools in the UK because the study took place in some ordinary UK secondary schools, so you could generalise to other ordinary UK secondary schools. But, as I showed you on that graph, adolescent smoking rates in the UK are now much lower than 15 years ago when the Assist research took place. When Assist took place, about 25% of 15-year-olds were smokers. Now it's about 5%. It's a bit odd to talk to your friends about smoking when nobody really smokes anyway. So maybe Assist is no longer useful in the UK. Might it be useful in other countries? So that brings me to the project that I'm involved, which, as I said, is funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. It's got a long name, but basically it's a small study at the moment. We're looking to see whether it might be possible to adapt or develop or test something like Assist in lower and middle income country settings. Might Assist work in other countries? Might it work in Indonesia? Would it work in the Indonesian education system? Would Indonesian students nominate the same sort of young people to be peer supporters? How would it all work? That's what we're trying to find out. Okay, so that's the end of me talking about Assist. And now I'm going to talk about something completely different. The tobacco in prison study. So just to point out, well, I'm showing you this. It's a title slide, but this is our logo for Tobacco in Prison Study, TIPS, and we've made it look like a cigarette, which we think is quite cool. This is Scotland. There are 15 prisons in Scotland. Here they are. Here's Glasgow, where I live. And it's a big study. Just there's loads and loads of people involved in it. The aim of the Tobacco in Prison study is to inform and evaluate the transition to prisons in Scotland becoming smoke-free. So why have a smoke-free prisons policy? Well, I've already told you the Scottish Government wants a tobacco-free Scotland by 2034. That means nobody's smoking. This is their document where they set all this out. About 70% of prisoners in Scotland were smoking. Just as a bit of context, prison staff were not allowed to smoke at work at all. They haven't been allowed to smoke at work in prisons since actually the mid-2000s, when the public place legislation came in, which said nobody's allowed to smoke at work. And prisoner smoking, well, it obviously impacts on the health of the prisoners who smoke. But of course, because of all that second-hand smoke in the air, it impacts on the health of staff and of the 30% of prisoners who do not smoke. So it's a very important issue. Just as some background, Scotland is by no means the first country to be interested in smoke-free prisons. This is a timeline, it's hard to see. But in 2008, so over 11 years ago, Canada introduced a total ban on smoking in prisons. In 2011, New Zealand did. By 2015, most of Australia had smoke-free prisons. And England and Wales now have smoke-free prisons. We did, here it is, we did a review to look at the evidence that had come from this work, and we found really virtually no research evidence. There was no evaluation of what had happened before and after. There was very limited evidence on what worked to make a smoke-free prison policy actually work better. Because obviously, the policy people, the prison people in Scotland, when they were thinking about a smoke-free prison, they were thinking, is this going to cause a riot? You know, I went to meetings and they were all talking about keeping the roof on the prisons. That's what they were talking about. So we said, well, there's not much evidence. I mean, we do know that from these other countries that the roofs haven't gone off the prisons, but that's just about all we know. So we'll do a study. So TIPS is a massive study. It's 3 phases. It's mixed methods. In phase 1, which was when we first began to get interested in this, and when there was talk about Scottish prisons going smoke-free, but only talk, we wanted to understand what things were like before any policy announcement. So in all 15 prisons, we measured levels of second-hand smoke. We gathered lots of views and information about staff health, prisoner health, what they thought about tobacco bans, how much they smoked. In July 2017, there was an official announcement from the Prison Service that there would be smoke-free prisons in Scotland from November 2018. So after that, our study moved into the next phase. The announcement had been made, everyone knew it was happening, and we wondered, do things change now people know it's happening? Do people's behaviour change even before the policy happens? Last November, about 10 weeks ago, the prisons went smoke-free. So now we're in phase 3. We're looking at the impact of this policy change on prisoners and staff and on the prison and the health service. I'm going to tell you just about, in detail, one thing that we did. In phase 1, before there'd even been an announcement, we measured second-hand smoke. Now, second-hand smoke is made up of over 4,000 chemicals, and you can see it, so that you can measure it. And it can be measured by markers in the air, either measuring the particles that there are in the air, or measuring nicotine. So when people smoke, nicotine doesn't just go into their bodies, it goes into the air as well. Yeah. I mean, I can stop after this, but I can't do this. Okay. You can also measure smoke by biomarkers, cotinine, which is a chemical in the body creates when it breaks down nicotine. And you can find cotinine in saliva. You can just measure cotinine in people's saliva, and it shows how much secondhand smoke they've inhaled. So what we did in late 2016 and early 2017, we went into all the prisons and we took, we measured the air markers. We took these little machines. They're called Dylos machines. They're about this big. And you can run them for 6 days at a time, and they'll take 6 days measurement of smoke particles. And they've got a little fan inside. They suck up the smoke, and they've got a laser that counts the particles, and they'll measure the particles over 6 days and keep it in their memory. And because they're quite small, you can also carry them around. So the prison staff just put the Dylos machines maybe on their desk where they worked, near all the cells where the prisoners were. But after they'd done that, they carried the Dylos machines around with them as they went on their jobs, as they opened and closed the cell doors or mended things or whatever. We also measured the amount of nicotine in the air, just with these little things, which are actually just sort of little tiny cups of sort of jelly stuff. And we just sat them down and they soak up the nicotine from the air. And we measured the cotinine in staff saliva. This is a picture of someone, they're just going to put a kind of cotton bud in their mouth to suck up their saliva. And we compared the cotinine in their saliva before and after a work shift to see how much nicotine they'd absorbed during a work shift. Now, I'm going to tell you the findings, and it's really important to know the WHO says there is no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke. What we found was, not surprisingly, clear evidence of exposure to secondhand smoke in all prisons in Scotland. We found average levels of exposure to secondhand smoke for prison staff was similar to those experienced by a non-smoker who lives in a home with a smoker. And we found that some common tasks, such as checking the cells or the guys who go in and maintain the cells if something's broken, can lead to very high secondhand smoke exposures because, of course, prisoners were smoking behind their cell doors, which in the UK are solid doors, and there was just like a mass of smoke. And this is just an example. This comes from Her Majesty's Prison in Grampian, which is in the north of Scotland. It's a modern prison, and it's just been chosen because the values are nearest to the average for all 15 prisons. And you can see it for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It's 6 days. There are the peaks of air particles showing smoke. This is night time, so the prisoners aren't smoking much at night, but you can see the peaks up and down during the day. The WHO, this is 25, and the WHO says that over a 24-hour period, exposure should certainly be no more than 25. Okay, so this is definitely going above that, a lot of that time. So tips, our results had policy impact. This is the BBC News website, and it said the Scottish Prison Service has today, and that was the day we published our report, announced its intention for all prisons in Scotland to be smoke-free by the end of 2018. Basically, they looked at our results and said, crumbs, we've been thinking about this, we'd better do it quickly. I'll do this in 2 minutes. And they said the move to smoke-free prisons has been further informed by the study. The Prison Service Chief Executive said, this report is a call to action. It's not acceptable those in our care and those who work in our prisons should be exposed to second-hand smoke. So what else have we done? Just to remind you, it's a big study. We've worked before the announcement, after the prisons became smoke-free. We've gathered absolutely tons of data from staff and prisoners on things like their self-reported health. What do they think about the policy? And what we've done with all this, we've given the results back to the Scottish Prison Service to say, this is what your staff think. This is some information that can help you implement this policy. So, for example, the prisoners were saying, if we can't smoke, you need to give us something else to do with our hands. And so people have been thinking, what do we give them to do? And they've been giving out colouring books and tangle teasers and things for people to do. Knitting. That's not for the men prisoners, but the women. We are collecting routine data that the prison service has on prisoner and staff health and on prison incidents, just to see what has happened to all those things before and after the policy change. And we're repeating our second-hand smoke measurements. We repeated them over the week when the prisons went smoke-free to see if they actually dropped. And we're going to repeat them in a few months' time. And you might say, well, why bother repeating second-hand smoke measurements if there's a smoking ban in the prisons? But of course, we all know that certainly in UK prisons, you can smuggle quite a lot into the prisons. So just because there is a smoking ban doesn't mean to say people might not be smoking. They won't be smoking so much, but there might still be some smoke. And I'm going to stop there. I was going to tell you about movie smoking, but I haven't got time. So I think that'll do. Okay? Oh, it's okay. Is that okay? I mean, I could just sit down. Okay. This is quite a quick one. I just thought you might be quite interested in this. I don't know if anyone knows about this whole idea. Movie smoking. So this is, again, it's something completely different. And it's the idea that there is a link between seeing images of smoking and starting to smoke. So what's it all about? Well, don't we all know, actually, that smoking has been used in movies, in films, to help show the image of characters. So you can't really see very well here, but here's some films. And generally people who smoke are cool, or they're sexy, or they're glamorous. We know that, really. And we also know teenagers like going to the movies. We know they're at a stage of life when they're just experimenting with their own image. Do they want to be cool or sexy or glamorous? And so it is possible that movies might be an important influence on teenagers experimenting with smoking. We know this really, don't we? And actually, of course, the tobacco industry knows this. And what the tobacco industry has done, because in many countries, as I showed you in the UK, there's been a ban on advertising. They can't advertise. Well, what on earth are they going to do to advertise? You could put a cigarette in a film, couldn't you? And there's quite a lot of the people, particularly in America, have been able to gather a lot of tobacco industry and kind of secret papers together to find what sort of things they've been doing. Just as some examples, this is quite old, but in 1982, there was a public relations firm letter to a tobacco producer, and it said, recently there have been a number of high visibility feature films in which one or more of the central characters smoke a particular brand of cigarettes. This has been happening because cigarette manufacturers have been paying for the exposure. Sounds a bit like an advert to me. And in 1989, the House of Representatives heard how in the 2 years beforehand, Philip Morris, which is a big tobacco company, had supplied free cigarettes and other props for 56 films. Why would they do that? Really kind. And also how Philip Morris and other companies were paying large amounts of money to get their cigarettes into certain films. So you would see the brand of the cigarette. So because of this, researchers in the United States it was a kind of strand of research called movie smoking research. I'm going to give you 3 examples. One was this one, tobacco use is increasing in popular films. This was published at the end of the 90s. And this just basically showed that there was increased tobacco in films shown in the States from the 1980s to the 1990s. Of course, in real life in the States, tobacco use had gone down, so the films weren't portraying real life. And of course, smoking was usually shown as cool. You didn't see the bad effects on films. You didn't see anybody dying of cancer or having yellow teeth or fingers. This was an experimental study. Cigarette smoking in popular films, does it increase viewers' likelihood to smoke? And basically, it just showed that smokers, if they watch clips, little short bits of films, including smoking, they feel like smoking. If they just watch films with no smoking, they didn't feel like smoking. And this really important work, which was started by a guy called Jim Sargent, who we later on went to work with, he actually looked at the association between seeing tobacco use in films and trying smoking among adolescents. This was a cross-sectional study. And what he did was he gave teenagers in a survey a massive list of films, and they just had to tick off if they'd seen that film, and they had to tell him if they were a smoker. That's all they had to do. But what he and his research team had done was look carefully through all those films to find out and to code very objectively how much smoking is in each of these films. So that meant that when the adolescents had ticked which films they'd seen, the researchers could say, this young person happens to have seen films that have got lots of smoking in. This young person happens to have seen films that don't have much smoking in. But as I say, really importantly, the films were coded by the researchers for how much smoking was included. The study participants, the teenagers, were never asked about smoking in films they'd seen. They just had to tick a list. And from this research, he concluded there was strong, direct, and an independent association between seeing tobacco use in films and having tried cigarettes. And so that led to some research that we were involved in, which was Smoke-Free Movies Europe, the European Smoking in the Movies study. It was a 6-country study: Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Poland, Iceland, and Scotland. There were about 16,500 teenagers took part, and it was longitudinal. We surveyed secondary pupils in 2010, and we followed them up a year later. Scotland, that's the little logo we made for it in Scotland. It's got the EU flag and the Scottish flag. We had about 3,000 took part in Scotland. I'm going to really quickly show you the results. We published lots, actually. The first paper just looked at the cross-sectional association between looking at seeing smoking in movies and adolescent smoking. I have to say that when I started this, I did not believe that there would be a link. I thought, how can smoking in movies be associated with adolescent smoking? This is the result. So look how strong that association is. That's overall in all 6 countries. This is the UK, which was Scotland. This is the number of smoking scenes that the researchers estimated a young person had seen based on the films that they said they'd seen. And this is the proportion who had ever smoked. Look at that relationship. So those who'd seen more smoking scenes in films were more likely to be smokers. So we concluded the link between smoking in movies and adolescent smoking is robust, and it transcends different cultural contexts. It's not just in the States, it's certainly happening in Europe. But of course that was a cross-sectional study, and it could be that young people who smoke happen to choose films that happen to have a lot of smoking in them. So because we'd followed them up, we were able to do the same thing, looking at the amount of smoking they'd seen, they reported in the films they'd seen in 2010, and whether they'd started smoking by 2011. And again, we found a strong association. And so we concluded that seeing smoking in movies is a predictor of smoking onset in different cultural contexts. I think this is really interesting. It's led to quite a lot of activism in the States. You can find there's a website, Smoke-Free Movies, which sort of, is always sending messages to Disney and the various film studios about how much smoking there is in various bits of film. So they've really tried to alert policymakers to this, and public and, young people. In Scotland, this document that you've already seen has picked up on this. They said, we remain concerned representation of tobacco and smoking in the media can create a false impression. Smoking is glamorous, normal, can influence young person to take up smoking. So they're maintaining pressure on the UK government to do something about this. So something people are aware of interesting. And that's it. That's a summary. I'm stopping there. I haven't got any conclusions because it was so many different things that I wanted to tell you about. It was just some examples. But I've told you I'm from a country strong on tobacco control with falling smoking rates, and I've given you 3 examples of the kind of work that I do.